They took her forge, her father's tools, and the roof over her head before she had turned 20 years old, and left her standing in the dust of Redemption Flat, Arizona territory, with $4 and a canvas bag holding everything she had left in the world. The man who cast her out was her own uncle, Cyrus Calder, who had arrived within a week of her father's burial with papers claiming the smithy had been mortgaged to him years before. Papers no one in town thought to question, because grief makes people slow, and because Cyrus Calder smiled the way honest men rarely bother to. With her $4 gone to a week's lodging and a length of rope, she accepted what the town considered a joke of an offer. The old vein forge out past Copperhead Ridge, abandoned 11 years, its furnace cold since the smith who built it vanished into the desert without a word. Given to her entirely for free, because not one soul in Redemption Flat believed it worth even the trouble of tearing down. They called it cursed. They called her desperate. What none of them knew, what she herself would not discover for weeks, was that sealed behind the cold stone of that furnace lay something that would not only restore her father's name, but would return to an entire drought-starved town the very thing that had been quietly stolen from it for a decade. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Calder. If a place has ever looked worthless to everyone but you, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you find yourself drawn to stories where the forgotten turn out to matter most, we'd be glad if you stayed a while longer with us. Follow or subscribe to the channel so the next story like Josephine's finds its way to you. Josephine Calder had grown up in the ring of hammer on iron, in a town that existed only because a vein of copper had once run rich beneath the red hills to its north, and that had settled, once the richest ore played out, into the smaller, steadier business of serving the ranches and freight lines that still passed through on their way to somewhere larger. Her father, Ezekiel Calder, had come to Redemption Flat as a young smith in 1868, when the copper was still good and the town still had ambitions of becoming a city. And he had stayed long after those ambitions faded. Because a good blacksmith is needed by a small, poor town in a way he is not always needed by a rich one. He shod horses and mended plow blades and fixed the freight wagons that broke their axles on the washboard roads, and he did it, always for a fair price, even when a harder man might have charged what the desperate could be made to pay. Josephine's mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it had been Ezekiel who raised her, in the only way he knew, which was to bring her into the forge as soon as she was old enough to hold a rasp and teach her everything he understood about fire and iron and patience. He taught her that iron, unlike most things in this world, told you the truth about itself if you watched it closely enough, that its color in the forge fire spoke plainly of its readiness, cherry red for bending, white and sparking for welding, and that a smith who tried to rush the metal before its color was right would only ruin the work and waste the ore. He taught her, too, that the forge itself was a kind of covenant between smith and fire, that you fed it carefully, tended it faithfully, and it repaid you with the heat that let you shape hard things into useful ones, and that this same patience, applied to people and to trouble, tended to serve a person just as well as it served the metal. She was 17 when she first noticed that her father had begun turning away certain jobs from the Anders Cattle Company, the largest ranching outfit in the county, jobs that would have paid handsomely, and that Ezekiel Calder, in leaner years, would never have refused. When she asked him why, he told her only that some money cost more than it paid, and that he had learned some years back not to do close business with men who controlled a thing everyone needed and used that control the way other men used a gun. She did not fully understand what he meant then, though she would come to understand it with painful clarity in the years that followed, once she learned the name of the man he had been speaking of, Silas Pruitt, who had arrived in Redemption Flat some 12 years before, with money enough to buy the deed to Copperhead Spring, the single reliable water source for miles in every direction, and who had spent every year since quietly turning that ownership into a kind of soft, unspoken rule over the entire valley. It was Silas Pruitt who set the price ranchers paid to water their herds. Pruitt, who decided which farms got enough water to keep their fields green through the dry months, and which did not. And Pruitt, who, more than once, had let a family's crop wither rather than extend them credit on their water bill, a lesson the whole valley had learned to fear repeating. Ezekiel Calder was one of the few men in Redemption Flat who had never once gone to Pruitt hat in hand, because the smithy had its own modest well, sunk by the original owner decades before Pruitt ever arrived. And Ezekiel guarded that independence fiercely, understanding that a man beholden to no one for his water was a man who could afford to speak honestly about everything else. Josephine grew into her father's daughter in every way that mattered, quick with her hands, steady in her judgment, unwilling to bow her head simply because someone else held more coin than she did. She learned to shoe a horse properly by the time she was 15, to weld a broken wagon tongue by 16, and by 18 she could run the forge alone for days at a time, when her father's rheumatism kept him from the anvil, taking in work under her own name and delivering it with a quality that quieted, one job at a time, the doubts of customers who had never before trusted a woman's hand at a forge. It was, she would later understand, the finest inheritance her father ever gave her, finer even than the smithy itself, not the tools, though she loved them, but the conviction that honest, patient work was worth more than any shortcut, and that a person who tended their fire faithfully need never bow to a man simply because he controlled the water. Ezekiel Calder died in the winter of 1889, his heart giving out one cold morning at the forge, hammer still in his hand, and Josephine buried him in the small cemetery on the hill above town, beside the wife he had lost 20 years before. She had scarcely finished grieving when her Uncle Cyrus arrived from Prescott, a man she had met perhaps twice in her whole life, full of sorrowful words about family duty, and full, as it turned out, of far more dangerous things besides. Cyrus Calder produced, within days of his arrival, a set of papers bearing what appeared to be Ezekiel's signature, documenting a loan Cyrus claimed to have made his brother some 6 years prior, secured against the smithy and its land, a debt Ezekiel had supposedly never repaid. Josephine knew, in her bones, that her father would never have mortgaged the forge, the one piece of independence he had spent his whole life protecting. But she was 20 years old, freshly bereaved, with no lawyer and no standing in a county courthouse that took a stranger's notarized papers over a grieving girl's certainty. And Cyrus Calder, it emerged, had taken the precaution of having his documents examined and approved by a circuit judge in Prescott before he ever arrived in Redemption Flat, ensuring that by the time Josephine understood what was happening, the matter was already, on paper, settled. She fought it as best she could, walking the 6 miles to the county seat to plead her case before a clerk who looked at her with more pity than power to help, and she learned in the process the particular helplessness of a young woman without money trying to contest a man who had arrived already knowing exactly which doors would open for him and which would not. Within 3 weeks of her father's death, Cyrus Calder held clear legal title to the smithy, the tools, and the little house behind it, and he informed his niece, with the same performed sorrow he had used from the start, that he intended to sell the property to a buyer already interested in the land, and that she would need to vacate within the fortnight. Josephine left Redemption Flats Main Street with a canvas bag containing 2 dresses, her father's smoking pipe, and the small hammer he had given her on her 12th birthday, small enough to have been overlooked by Cyrus's inventory of the forge's more valuable tools. She had $4 to her name, earned from mending harness leather for a freighter passing through in her final week at the smithy. And she spent most of it on a week's room at the boarding house, while she tried to think what a blacksmith's daughter with no forge and no money could possibly do next in a town too poor to have much use for another set of idle hands. It was Hank Ostrander, who ran the feed store and had known Ezekiel Calder as a friend for 20 years, who first mentioned the old vein forge to her, more out of kindness than genuine hope that it would help. The place sat some 4 miles out past Copperhead Ridge, on a stretch of land no one wanted, built originally by a smith named Elijah Vane, back in the copper boom years, when the town had needed 2 forges instead of 1. Vane had run the place successfully for a time, Hank said, until one autumn morning in 1878 he had simply vanished, leaving his tools, his stock, and his half-built work sitting exactly where he'd left them, with no note, no warning, and no explanation anyone in Redemption Flat had ever settled on. Some said he'd fallen afoul of claim jumpers over some old mining dispute. Some said he'd simply walked off into the desert one hot day and never found his way back. Whatever the truth, no one had ever successfully worked that forge since, and the furnace itself, an unusually large stone-built structure Vane had constructed with more ambition than his modest trade required, had stood cold and silent for 11 years, its ownership passed, through a tangle of unpaid taxes, to the county itself, which considered the place worth so little it had simply stopped bothering to collect on it. When Josephine walked out to Copperhead Ridge 2 days later and found the county assessor, a tired, decent man named Mr. Trent, who happened to be passing through Redemption Flat on other business, he told her plainly that the county would be glad to be rid of the parcel entirely, that she was welcome to take possession of the Vane forge free of any charge whatsoever if she was foolish enough to want it, since the building's condition made it worth less than the paperwork required to sell it. Silas Pruitt himself, standing nearby at the mercantile counter and overhearing the exchange, had laughed outright and told her, not unkindly, but not gently either, that she'd be better off leaving that cursed pile of stone to the rattlesnakes, that Vane's own disappearance had left the place with a reputation no sensible person wanted attached to their name. But Josephine Calder, 20 years old, with nothing left to protect, and a great deal of her father's stubbornness still burning in her chest, told Mr. Trent she would take it, cursed reputation and all, because free was the only price she could currently afford, and a cold forge was still, in her estimation, better than no forge at all. She walked the 4 miles out to Copperhead Ridge with her canvas bag and her father's small hammer, and found the Vane forge exactly as 11 years of desert weather had left it. A squat stone building with a sagging roof, its yard choked with brittlebush and chawla. Its tools rusted where Elijah Vane had set them down mid-task and never returned to finish. The furnace itself dominated the small building, larger and more elaborately built than any forge furnace she had ever seen in a town the size of Redemption Flat, constructed of fitted desert stone rather than the simpler brick most smiths used, its firebox cold and choked with 11 years of blown sand and pack-rat nesting. It took her the better part of a week, working alone with tools she scavenged and repaired from Vane's own rusted stock, to clear the furnace enough to consider whether it could ever be relit. And it was in that process, on the 6th day, running her hand along the inside of the firebox to check the mortar for cracks the way her father had taught her, that she felt something her fingers should not have found there, a seam in the stone too regular, too deliberately fitted, to be simple construction. Working it loose with a cold chisel and considerable patience, she discovered that one entire section of the furnace's rear wall, easily 2 feet square, was in fact a false stone face set into a recessed cavity, built with a craftsman's precision to look, from any casual glance, exactly like the solid masonry surrounding it. Behind that false stone, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the desert damp at bay across 11 long years, Josephine found a leather satchel belonging to Elijah Vane, and inside it, a journal written in a cramped, careful hand, along with a set of legal-looking documents she did not, at first reading, fully understand. What she understood immediately from the journal's opening pages was that Elijah Vane had not vanished by accident, nor by misfortune, but had fled Redemption Flat deliberately, in fear for his life, because of exactly what those documents proved. The journal told her that Elijah Vane, before he was ever a blacksmith, had been the surveyor originally hired to establish the water claims for the entire Copperhead Valley back in 1871. Nearly 2 decades before Silas Pruitt ever arrived in the territory, at a time when the spring and its surrounding land had been formally designated, under a covenant filed with the Territorial Land Office, as a common water right belonging jointly to every homesteader and rancher then settled in the valley, rather than as private property belonging to any single owner. Vane had surveyed the boundaries himself, and had kept, among his own papers, the original filed covenant and survey map, precisely because he had watched, some years later, as a wealthy newcomer named Silas Pruitt arrived and quietly purchased what he claimed was the deed to Copperhead Spring from a corrupt land office clerk in Prescott. A deed that Vane's own original survey proved could never have been legally sold as private property in the first place, since the spring had never belonged to any single owner to sell. Vane's journal recorded, in increasingly anxious entries across the summer of 1878, how he had confronted the land office clerk privately about the discrepancy, how the clerk had grown frightened and admitted Pruitt had paid him handsomely to falsify the filing, and how Vane, troubled by his conscience, had begun quietly gathering the original covenant documents and his own survey notes, intending to bring them before the territorial governor's office to have the valley's true water rights restored to the community that had always held them. The final entries in the journal, written in a hand grown noticeably unsteady, described threats delivered to Vane by men he believed were in Pruitt's employ, warnings that he would do well to forget what he thought he knew about old surveys, and Vane's own growing fear that he would not live to see the matter settled honestly if he stayed in Redemption Flat any longer. The journal ended abruptly, mid-page, on an entry describing his plan to hide the documents inside his own furnace, the one place he was certain no one would ever think to search, until he could find a safer moment to carry them to the territorial capital himself. That safer moment, Josephine understood with a chill settling into her chest, had apparently never come. She sat in that cold furnace room for a long while after finishing the journal, the desert wind working at the loose roof shingles above her, understanding all at once the full weight of what she had stumbled into. Silas Pruitt had spent 12 years charging the ranchers and farmers of Copperhead Valley for water that had never legally been his to sell in the first place, had grown wealthy and powerful on a fraud that a frightened surveyor had died, or fled, or simply vanished trying to expose, and had, in some small and terrible way, cast the very shadow that had eventually reached her own father's forge, since it was Pruitt's quiet control over the valley's water and credit that had made men like Cyrus Calder believe they could act against an honest smith's daughter without consequence, in a town too dependent on Pruitt's goodwill to look too closely at anyone's business. Josephine did not act rashly. She spent the following weeks doing exactly what her father had taught her to do with difficult mettle. She watched, she waited, and she made certain of her facts before she attempted to shape anything at all. She walked the 6 miles to the county seat 3 separate times, each visit costing her a full day's labor she could ill afford to lose. until she found a records clerk willing, for a small fee, to help her locate the original 1871 Territorial Land Office filings. And there, exactly as Vane's journal had promised, she found the original covenant, water-stained but legible, establishing Copperhead Spring as common property of the valley's settlers, filed and witnessed a full 17 years before Pruitt's supposed deed of purchase, a deed which, upon closer examination by the very clerk who helped her, appeared to bear an amended filing date that did not match the ledger's own sequential numbering, exactly the kind of quiet fraud a frightened man might have confessed to a frightened surveyor 2 decades before. She might have taken this discovery straight to a lawyer and sought a quiet, private settlement for herself alone, restoring perhaps her family's own claim to fair water without ever disturbing Pruitt's broader hold over the valley. And there were nights, cold and hungry in the drafty ruin of the Vane Forge, when that lesser, safer path tempted her sorely. But she thought of her father turning away Pruitt's business rather than compromise his independence, and she thought of every rancher and farmer in Copperhead Valley who had spent 12 years paying a false master for water that had always belonged to them freely. And she understood that the honest thing, the thing her father would have wanted shaped from this discovery, was not a private settlement, but a public restoration. Word reached Silas Pruitt, as word always does in a small town, that the Calder girl had been asking pointed questions at the county land office and carrying old surveyor's papers around Redemption Flat. He came to find her himself on a hot afternoon in early summer, riding out to the Vane Forge with 2 of his hired men trailing behind him. And he stood in the doorway of the ruin she had been slowly, patiently restoring, and told her plainly that whatever old papers a dead man's madness had left behind meant nothing in a territorial court against a properly filed deed, and that she would be wise to remember how quickly a young woman alone, with no family and no standing, could find herself in serious trouble for spreading dangerous rumors about a respected businessman. Josephine, standing at her own anvil, with her father's small hammer still warm in her hand from the morning's work, told him only that she intended to bring the matter before the Territorial Land Office in Prescott, with proper legal counsel, and that he was welcome to bring his own lawyer to answer for the discrepancy in his deed's filing date whenever it suited him. Pruitt left angry but unwilling, in front of his own men, to threaten her more directly than he already had, and in the weeks that followed, Josephine felt the particular pressure a powerful man applies when he cannot simply crush an inconvenience outright. Merchants in Redemption Flat, who had begun bringing her small repair jobs, impressed by the quality of her work at the reopened Vane Forge, suddenly found reasons to take their business elsewhere. The bank in the county seat, when she inquired about a small loan to properly repair her roof before the coming winter, discovered an unexplained delay in processing her application that stretched on for weeks. Twice, she found her well fouled with debris that had not blown there by accident, though she could never prove whose hand had placed it. What turned the tide, in the end, was not a single dramatic confrontation, but the same patient accumulation of honest work that had always been her father's method. She wrote, with the county clerk's careful help, to the Territorial Land Office in Prescott directly, enclosing copies of both the original 1871 covenant and Elijah Vane's own survey notes, and requesting formally that the office investigate the irregularity in Pruitt's filing date. She spoke quietly, one at a time, to the ranchers and farmers of Copperhead Valley who had grown weary of Pruitt's water prices over the years, showing them, in the privacy of their own kitchens, copies of the original covenant that proved the spring had always belonged to them collectively, and asking only that they be willing to speak the truth if the territorial office ever came asking questions. Many were frightened, at first, of Pruitt's reach, but enough remembered Ezekiel Calder's honest dealings, and enough had grown tired enough of Pruitt's quiet tyranny that, one by one, they agreed to sign statements confirming what their own families had always understood the spring to be, long before any deed of Pruitt's had ever been filed. The territorial investigator who finally arrived in Redemption Flat that autumn, a careful, unhurried man named Mr. Aldous Fenwick, spent nearly 2 weeks examining records, interviewing ranchers, and comparing the sequential numbering of the county's original land filings against the suspiciously altered entry bearing Pruitt's name. And at the end of that fortnight he confirmed, in a formal finding delivered before the county courthouse, exactly what Vane's journal and Josephine's own patient research had already established: that Copperhead Spring had never been legally sold as private property, that the Covenant of 1871 remained the valley's true and binding claim, and that Silas Pruitt's deed, procured through the bribery of a since-deceased land office clerk, was void from its inception. Silas Pruitt did not go to prison, for the territorial courts of that era were rarely swift or thorough with men of his standing, and the clerk who might have testified most damningly against him had died some years before Josephine ever found Vane's journal. But the finding was recorded publicly, read aloud in the very courthouse where Cyrus Calder's fraudulent papers had once been quietly approved, and within the month, Pruitt found that the valley he had ruled through water and fear for 12 years no longer needed his permission for anything at all. Ranchers who had paid him for years began drawing freely from a spring the law now confirmed had always been theirs. His credit, once feared, no longer held any particular power over men who no longer required his goodwill to keep their herds alive through the dry season. And within a year, Silas Pruitt sold his remaining holdings in Redemption Flat and departed for territories where his name had not yet been so thoroughly examined, leaving behind him a valley that finally understood, at long last, exactly what had been taken from it and exactly who had returned it. Cyrus Calder, whose fraudulent claim to the original Calder smithy had always relied in part on the town's general deference to men of apparent means, found his own standing quietly diminished once Redemption Flat learned what kind of company he had kept in pressing his advantage against his niece, and it was Hank Ostrander, along with several other townsfolk who had known Ezekiel Calder honestly, who eventually helped Josephine bring a proper legal challenge against her uncle's original mortgage papers. A challenge that succeeded once a handwriting examiner in Prescott confirmed what Josephine had always known in her bones, that the signature on Cyrus's loan documents did not match her father's true hand in several telling particulars. The original smithy in town was restored to her by the spring of 1891, though by then Josephine had already grown attached to the Vane forge she had rebuilt with her own hands, and she chose, in the end, to keep both forges running, one in town and one out past Copperhead Ridge, employing, within a few years, 2 apprentices of her own, teaching them exactly what her father had taught her about patience and iron and the particular satisfaction of honest work fairly done. And so we come back to where this story began, to a young woman of 20 standing in the dust with $4 to her name, accepting for free a cursed ruin that an entire town believed fit only for rattlesnakes and bad memory. Josephine Calder never once regretted walking those 4 miles out to Copperhead Ridge, because what she found waiting inside that cold furnace was not merely her own restoration, though it was certainly that, but the long-buried truth an entire valley had needed for 12 years and never known to look for. She had learned from her father that iron reveals its true nature to those patient enough to watch its color change in the fire, and she had learned, in the ruin of Elijah Vane's forsaken forge, that the same patience applied to people, to old papers, and to old wrongs tends to bring the truth to light exactly when it is needed most. She did not relight that furnace seeking treasure. She relit it seeking only a way to keep working with her hands in the only trade she had ever loved, and the treasure she found there was never gold, but justice, returned at last to the very community that had once called her foolish for wanting it at all. Thank you for spending this quiet hour out at Copperhead Ridge with us, and with Josephine Calder, and with the cold furnace that held far more than anyone ever expected of a worthless, forgotten forge. If this story stirred something in you, a memory of some overlooked thing, some abandoned place, or some small inheritance the world had already written off as worthless, we would be glad to hear it in the comments below. And we'd be grateful if you shared this story with someone who needs reminding that the things given away for free are sometimes the very things that were never truly anyone's to sell. We'll leave you tonight with the question Josephine herself might have carried out across that desert road. What is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already decided was worth nothing at all? Until next time, stay close.